Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Policy Research. I thought we might get started. As many of you know, we have this regular series here at the Center for Policy Research, which we call "Clearing the Air" with a question mark, a seminar series on Delhi's air pollution. And the aim of the series is really to try and understand the sources of pollution, the kinds of policy debates around what to do about those sources, and really broaden the public conversation and debate in an informed fashion around air pollution. So we've had a series of seminars on the data on different pollutant levels. We've talked about the health impacts. We've talked about different sectors. We've talked about waste, agriculture and crop burning, the transport sector, and we're going to shortly talk about power plants in a couple of weeks. But today we thought we would pause a little bit from this source-by-source discussion and invite into the conversation Anumita Roy Chowdhury from the Center for Science and Environment, who will be known to many of you, because CSE and Anumita in particular has been a very important actor in the air pollution debates in India and certainly in Delhi. So the aim of today's conversation is really to sort of pause a little bit and take stock of and have a conversation with somebody who can tell us a little bit about what happens when you try and do something about all these problems, to pull back the curtain a little bit on... is that okay? Okay. Pull back the curtain a little bit on the actual advocacy, efforts by the courts, efforts through the bureaucracy, through the executive to make changes. So let me briefly introduce Anumita. Many of you will be familiar with CSE and with their work, but in brief, let me find the right bit. Here we go. So Anumita is formerly the Executive Director for Research and Advocacy and Head of the Air Pollution and Clean Transport Program at CSE. She co-authored the book that many of you will have seen, Slow Murder, The Deadly Story of Vehicular Pollution in India, that catalyzed the Right to Clean Air campaign in India. She's spoken and written extensively about air pollution over the years. And in 2016, she was awarded the Hagen-Smith Clean Air Award for recognition of her work by the California EPA. So we're really, really pleased to have Anumita. On a personal note, I've known Anumita for many years, and we've had many conversations, and it's always been both enjoyable and really informative. So I think the same will hold true today. So welcome Anumita.
Thank you so much, Navroz. I mean, truly, I'm so excited. When you invited me, I really jumped at the idea. Truly looking forward to this conversation. It means so much to us. It's a very serious public health crisis that we recognize. So therefore, this conversation, and I'm truly looking forward to it.
Great. So to try and keep this as engaging as possible, we thought we would run this in a conversational style. So Anumita and I will be having a chat. All we miss is like a fire here to have like a fireside chat feel to it, but we'll do our best. And then as soon as possible, we'll open it up to the rest of you for a broader conversation. So let me start with sort of if you like, a softball question in the tradition of all interviewers. Before we dig a little bit deeper, Anumita, into the kinds of work that you all have been doing, maybe you can give us a little bit of a sense, looking across the spectrum of your work, of a couple of areas where you think you've had really some notable successes, where there's really been sort of a big push forward, as well as maybe an example of something where you've had a setback, and then we can sort of unpack some of those a little bit more and go a bit deeper.
Right, Navroz. So it's really tough and challenging to capture this whole experience. Now our campaign, which now spans over more than 20 years. Mm-hmm. So imagine when we began our campaign around 1996. And so I always love to highlight two turning points. One, that was around 1990 to 2003, and the other 2015 onwards. Now, if you try and understand our experience around these two turning points, as far as action on air pollution is concerned, when we started, there was very little conversation. And the whole challenge was that how do you create value in clean air in society, when no one was even talking about it, but the problem was already very big. The science was extremely weak. We did not have our own evidence. You really had to scavenge for information from across the world by talking to regulators, by talking to different actors in other parts of the world, and then try and excite, provoke, shock, and use those techniques initially to draw attention to the problem. You had to bring doctors and you had to use pictures. You had no evidence, no data with you. So you would show the lung pictures to people. You would try and do organized things which is going to draw attention because you're also facing huge amount of denial because it was so easy to dismiss the whole problem as dust from Rajasthan. Right? That's exactly what was happening around that point of time. But the success part is that it was possible to still mobilize the key actors of change, so the judiciary, the media, and to some extent public opinion. Even though I'm saying that around that time the conversation was extremely limited, but at the same time there was still a huge amount of concern at the same time. I mean, we could feel that concern even during late 90s. Therefore, to mobilize that opinion, to be able to bring and write information out in the public domain. And the key challenge for us was that how do you make this issue visible, deepen public understanding, help people and those who can make a difference join the dots, and then push for action. Now, once you were able to mobilize these actors of change, the judiciary, which was already looking into this matter, actually more than over 10 years even then. So the MC Mehta case had actually started in 1986, okay, which is still going on. But for 10 years, you virtually got nothing out of it because you had a case in the court, but no one to drive it. So therefore, this also was very clear to us. You may have an instrument with you, but if you do not have the power of knowledge, science to drive that, then you don't get what you can get out of it. So that was the first thing. But understand that that initial success that came was more out of the desperation, because at that point of time, you're not really talking about the larger systemic air quality planning process management, but you're seeking reprieve. You're seeking immediate relief because the problem was already so big. So you had to therefore work with several measures which were more binary in nature, yes or no, do CNG, take the polluting industry out, ban 15-year-old commercial vehicles. And those were the kind of strategy that got pushed initially.
Can I just sort of interrupt the question there? So of course we all know that the CNG was a huge success. It brought the curve down. Do you think that the public awareness level at the time was sufficient to actually sustain the campaign, through the next 15 years, or are we, in other words, is that battle still remain to be won?
So at that point of time, the public support and public opinion was not strong enough, and that's the reason why the initial period was more about confrontation. And if you really go back and dig out that history, you will find that CNG was truly a big fight. You would even have riots on the streets. And that, but in a way it was good because the moment you have riots on the street, that means each and every person in that city is somehow connecting with it. But after that initial, I'm not going to go too much into that, but to say that all of that happened and you did see some improvement, not in terms of clearing the air, but in terms of stabilizing the problem. But what we lost after that is the momentum. And it was a slowdown that happened after that. So after that initial success, which was recognized, and the big turnaround was as far as the political understanding of the issue was. The politics, which was so confrontational before, now after the initial success, you could still have a lot more engagement. And then you could have a lot more discussion around how to take the policy forward. But if you take this 2007 to 2013, 14, at that period, you would see that in terms of action, we slowed down enormously. But in terms of debate, in terms of conversation, that did build up during that period of time. And that has kind of helped us to catalyze a lot of new action now. And it's important for us to understand that every time when we are trying to push for change, to win public opinion means that whether you have put out enough information out in the public domain for people to even understand what needs to be done. Because after that initial few action that happened, we know that now today the solutions that we are talking about are also extremely much more complex in nature. And it is very difficult, therefore, at one level to build public opinion on air pollution and what it is doing to our health. That is the easier part of the conversation. But the more difficult part of the conversation is a strategy that you require to meet the clean air standards.
Right.
And that's where we're facing the biggest challenge today.
Okay. So can you then take a sort of fast forward us through, I guess in terms of that larger strategy, the building, correct me if I'm wrong, but the building blocks around that strategy are the comprehensive action plan, and then in the short run, the graded response action plan, both of which of you all have played a large
So
role
let's
in.
understand.
So if you could just sort of, is that in fact the kind of the way to understand the strategy for the city? And if so, maybe you could just
So
expand
let's
on that.
understand this, the second turning point, which I would say 2015 onwards.
Okay.
So why is this period different? One, that around this time, a lot more people are talking about this. There is something called citizen science in the city, where people themselves are going around with their own air quality monitors, even to know that what they're inhaling. There is a lot more pressure today. There is international glare. So in many ways, the issue has drawn a lot more visibility than before. So this
how
means
important do you think the international glare was? And particularly
Well,
the China comparisons.
I know because well, that in many ways did put pressure, but it's a little unfortunate that you have to really depend on that, because I see this chest beating that goes on, that I come to India and this happens to me, but whereas every day the number of complaints that we're getting from people here, okay, who themselves are suffering, that never draws that attention, okay, so that's clearly an issue that we need to look at. So, but nonetheless, with all that glare, and then the other important change that has happened, that 2015 and this period has started a lot more with our own science evidence and health evidence. So a lot more studies today. The scientific community today is much more involved with this issue than they were earlier. So that meant even the same actors of change, if you look at the judiciary, which is really one of the very important platforms where a lot of new decisions are being catalyzed. And here you will find is very fascinating that how that system is sourcing its knowledge and science to take decision, because that's often not clear to people, because often people think, hey, there's some chief justice or a judge sitting there and taking some arbitrary decision based on some half-baked information. But it's very fascinating that if you read today's study, all the reports and what the courts are looking at today and how they are filtering the science. So around this time, so when they're looking at the Kanpur study, and it's fascinating to see how judges looking at the two pie charts, that how different sources of pollution are contributing. Yeah, right? And and they're saying, hey, there are so many different pollution sources in my city. I need to know what you're doing on each of them. And that's kind of started the process where the directives started to come on each one of them. Therefore, this recognition that you cannot clean up just with one strategy at a time, but you need a more comprehensive approach, and that's how it started. Second, the other signs that they're filtering in, that by this time, health ministry more deeply involved, saying that, look, just don't look at the ambient concentration, but try and understand exposure, what you and I, as people, are inhaling. And that health evidence became the most important part of that decision making. Even to the extent they took notice of all these maps that show that this whole aerial view of pollution. And that clearly shows that pollution does not follow any political boundary, and therefore you cannot keep your action confined only to the city. So from 2015 onwards, all the decisions that you've got from the Supreme Court are meant for the entire National Capital Region. Okay, so it's no longer just city of Delhi. So that's another big transition, the change that we have seen. Now with all this, and then the court is also saying, I also need to understand the science, which is telling me that while pollutants are generically bad, but how do I understand toxicity? So pollutants coming from combustion sources, okay, so then they are actually looking at the science of Health Effect Institute, which is showing that particulate matter overall together is bad, but particulate matter coming from coal combustion, from diesel combustion is much more harmful. So therefore, all the decisions that are coming are actually keeping this science. So don't think that the decisions that have come are kind of, isolated from the scientific conversation that is happening in this country. The next issue is that what really brought the change finally is that horrible smog of 2016 November. Okay, And that was a time when the Supreme Court asked that if you already have a national air quality index and you have classified air quality as good, bad, and ugly, then where is your response system when you get this kind of smog? And we need to know what is your emergency plan. So that led to the Graded Response Action Plan, which was notified under the Environment Protection Act in January 2017. Now, this is a response plan which is you need to take decision on a daily basis depending on what the pollution is like. But the court also said simultaneously that you cannot be only on emergency mode and you need systemic reforms. And therefore, I also need to know what is your comprehensive action plan. Therefore, for all the sources that you've seen in the IIT Kanpur report, need to know what are your short, medium, and long-term action. I need to know who are the agencies responsible and the timeline for that action. Now, that action plan has been finally approved and notified at this March. It has been a pretty long process, but it has happened. So that's where it's opening up new opportunity. But let's understand that this comprehensive action plan makes a very important point. It says that here is a plan, but try and understand the challenge in the city. Given the current levels, the city needs to reduce its PM levels by at least 74% to meet the clean air standard. So for the first time, you have got some idea about what reduction target you're talking about. But still, the science is not so refined for us to say that, okay, 74% reduction, but in how many years? Okay, do we need to further kind of break it down to say, okay, 25% in 1 year, or can we do it, the entire reduction within the next 2 years? I mean, we don't know that yet. But at least the target gives you a sense that you need to have a very stringent action. But the question here is, and that is to address what you're saying, first is to have a plan, this kind of a scientific basis, that what I need to do to get there. But the bigger challenge that we're facing today, that is much easier to make a plan. But what everyone needs to understand that what is that behind the scene, okay? That what is it that you need to do to push each and every strategy. And the strategy and action to take, to materialize, and what it requires, that's really the most challenging part today.
Okay, no, so I think it's a fascinating sort of tour. I was struck by a couple of things in particular. You said two moments that you said were very important. One is the recognition of the complexity of this, in that there are multiple sources, and therefore you need a comprehensive plan that looks at the multiplicity of sources. And the second, the reframing of this in more serious science around health, and a recognition of that. So those two things are both very welcome in that they recognize the complexity of the challenge and they're framing it appropriately. I want to come back, however, to a point that it also, those two things, while necessary, also increase the degree of difficulty for the public to understand, therefore, what needs to happen.
Exactly.
If this is just about transport, you can get your head around it. If, as the Kanpur study says, it's 20% about transport, 38% about road dust, 12% about domestic sources, 11% about industrial sources, and on and on and on. And each of these issues has its own challenges in politics, which brings us back to your last point, which is what you need to do in each of these cases.
Right.
Then, for the average citizen, the picture becomes a lot more murky. And I would say it also perhaps becomes difficult for the citizen to understand the health story. Yeah. It's much easier if you're talking about one particle, say PM 2.5. You're not talking about secondary particles. You're not talking about the toxicity of diesel and so on and so forth. So I'd like to come back to this at the end. I wonder if there is a simpler version, whether we need different kind of layered stories, where there is a version of the story that for the public,
right,
they can sort of appreciate in a half an hour kind of digestible piece, with clear indications on what to do. Maybe we can pick up where you ended though and talk a little bit about, well, I'd like to do two things. I'd like to come back to your sort of invitation to talk about the implementation issues in particular areas. But before doing that, maybe you could kind of give us a little bit of, your war stories from the trenches. What did it take to push through the Graded Response Action Plan? Who are your allies? Who are your enemies, at least those you can name? What role were the courts actually playing? How did you interact with different elements of the bureaucracy? Maybe a couple of anecdotes to give a flavor of what it took to get both the GRAP and the CAP
Right.
through.
So let's understand GRAP, and there are several experiences there. The GRAP, which got implemented for the first time this winter, and it was decided that winter will be from October to March, and during that period, all action predefined for poor, very poor, and some for severe will be implemented throughout the winter as a default measure, because you just can't keep taking decision on each and every action on a day-to-day basis, right? Now, when that started in October, it started by shutting down Badapur power plant. Now, but there was a big fight behind that, okay, to get them to agree to do that, but they did it, right? So they shut down generator sets. They shut down brick kilns in NCR, okay, that happened. But understand, okay, they shut down, but what it led to, and a very fascinating story about the brick kiln. The brick kiln owners who then descended on us and said that, look, what is the way out for us? And then you use that to negotiate. And how do you negotiate? You tell them that, look, if you give it in writing an affidavit that you're willing to change from the conventional kiln to the more improved technology, and those who move to the improved technology of zigzag, they will be allowed to continue to operate. And it's fascinating today, the hundreds of affidavits that have come from the brick kiln owners who are otherwise the most resistant lobby against it, to say that now this few months that they're all going to take to change over to zigzag. So therefore understand, once you take a decision, you also have to spend time negotiating, okay, and you have to win them over.
Just to dig into that, do you have any sense of the data on what proportion of the brick kilns in the larger airshed have switched over,
it's a little bit,
and what the reduction is from the between these two technologies?
So the numbers are there, that how many, I think about, so they finally, they have got affidavits today from about close to 2,000 as of now, what they have, but they're much larger. Some of them have already. Total numbers I can give that to you, but that's all available. It's all kind of on record. So, but then it's tough today to say that how much that might have reduced. Only that action. We really don't have that kind of modeling happening right now.
No, I just mean not in terms of the total PM level, but in terms of the share of what brick kilns used to emit. So if they emitted X, is it 80% of X?
No, see, during winter, they were all shut.
Right.
Okay, so now there were leakages. I mean, you will hear stories that despite the orders, there were few that were still operating, but technically and legally, they were all supposed to be shut.
Right.
But now the whole process is starting with the zigzag. They will come on. The others will have to be permanently shut. So that process is going on right now. But that's one. The second part of the whole thing was that, but the lesson from GRAP is that some actions, especially those related to the formal sector, like power plant, these are easier to enforce. But the informal sector and the area-wide sources like waste burning, construction activity, these are really tough to enforce. So even though we are saying that, there were decisions to control them, but the leakages have been equally, because it's very tough. So somewhere along the line, and that's the reason why court said that you have to link your emergency with a more systemic reform. Right. So that was a big thing. Similarly, when you're saying during GRAP, you have to increase your parking charges by 3 to 4 times, and the city does not even have parking policy to identify where you can park and where you cannot park. Obviously, it's not going to work, right? So these are the lessons for us, and clearly, therefore, they really have to now see how to take this forward. But the larger, but on the CAP, now even though CAP as a policy and a plan has been notified right now, but there are several strategies in it, and that's where you'll get a sense of what the big fights are all about. So one is a truck fight. Now, court has said long time ago that you have to bypass the trucks from Delhi, but then we had to get down to generate our own data and evidence to show that that has made no impact, and the numbers have continued to be as big as ever. And then we also realized that it's much cheaper for truck to go through Delhi than take other toll roads. So that's the reason why the Supreme Court then gave this directive that each and every truck that enters Delhi should pay an environment compensation charge to make it more expensive for them. But then we now understand the role that we have to play of a watchdog. It's not enough to say that you have taken a decision and we have implemented. You also have to be a watchdog to keep seeing whether what you're doing, have you been able to implement it effectively enough? So the very recent survey that we've done just a month ago, that showed that despite the environment compensation charge and everything else, there's so much corruption and leakage, right? That the numbers have not changed much. But therefore, we are saying today that the other court order related to truck, which said that you implement RFID technology for electronic collection of the charge and you eliminate manual. We are saying you push that first, right? But understand for each one of these, the amount of time and energy that you have to therefore spend the concessionaire for RFID, talking to the MCDs, talking to all of them, constant negotiation process, and you yourself have to be equipped enough to come up with evidence to show that it's not working. So that's the challenge. And the other very big fight that this last year that was a big win actually, when we looked into the industrial pollution. And that's when we realized that this entire industrial belt is using one of the dirtiest bottom of the barrel fuel, the pet coke and the furnace oil. So again, we had to bring our own evidence. We got this fuel tested. Imagine pet coke has sulfur level as high as 74,000 parts per million. That makes complete mockery of the whole initial effort to bring transport fuel of BS6 at 10 parts per million. Right? So you have done so much fight to get 10 parts per million, and you are burning 74,000 parts per million with no pollution control. And when we took that to the Supreme Court, that was really one of the most powerful evidence that we could give. And then we also realized that so many years after independence, but 34 groups of industry in this country, they still do not have gaseous fuel standards. So therefore the court said, we are going to ban this fuel in Delhi and NCR and the 4 states around, okay, because this is the pollution hotspot. But for the rest of the country, we want all these standards to come and enforced. And that has happened. So here in many ways, the Delhi action has also catalyzed the national action. You know, so therefore imagine how you do this fight. So you are then doing decoy operation. You're going to all this industrial estate. You are collecting the sample. You're pretending to be something. Okay, so that's the behind the scenes story. Okay, that happens.
Are you saying you're not recognized? Sorry, go ahead.
So that's how it happens. So, but this is one very big piece that we won. The other problem that we have faced is that which is about that solutions are becoming very complex. And even if you list them as a checklist that this needs to be done to control pollution, if the principles are not right and defined, okay, then it's kind of lead to a lot of unintended consequences. And one of the biggest example of that is parking policy. Parking policy. So parking policy as a mobility transition measure, as a vehicle restraint measure, we have been fighting for this since 2006 when we went to the court and said now the city requires vehicle restraint policy. But now the court understood, and if you really look at that point of time, all the orders that came, the court said we need parking policy as a demand management measure. And they give directive to all the MCDs and to the DDA and everyone to come up with their policy. But when their policy came, this is all supply driven, they gave their wish list of how many multi-level car parks they want to make. Okay? And they wanted to be monitored based on whether they are meeting the schedule of completing the multi-level car parks. Right? Now that full story that unfolded around that time, it has continued till now. But good part is that now Delhi government has finally come up with the parking rules and the parking guidelines, and it for the first time has very clearly defined it as a demand management measure where you need to come up with a parking area management plan where you identify illegal parking, you identify illegal parking, penalize illegal parking, and then you are also pricing it in a way that it acts as demand management. But this is where you lose people. And this is what we really have to understand, that at one level you are building public awareness, and there are a lot of people today who understand that awareness is good.
Can you explain why you lose people there?
Sorry?
Can you elaborate on that point about losing people?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. So here, today, as I said, that a lot more people are actually aware and they're talking about air pollution and what it's doing to their health. But when it comes to translating that awareness to building support for measure which is actually challenging lifestyle, okay, that's where you're losing them. Okay, and then you'll find that all time is bizarre, whether it's for parking or whether government of Delhi is right now coming up with this approved fuel list. Okay, and I can see the moment they say please don't use charcoal for tandoor, now they're kind of the reaction that is coming in, but tandoor, I'm going to lose the taste if it's gas-based. What will happen to tourism?
Right.
Now, the same middle class, which is buying air purifier but wants a tandoor, okay? I mean, how do you resolve this?
Right.
So that's the disconnect, which now the next awareness campaign really has to take on.
Okay, no, I think that's very useful and very instructive, and I think it comes back to the discussion we were having earlier about sort of public awareness and support, and I think there are you talked about quite a long list of well, there's a very long list in the comprehensive action plan, and you gave us examples of a few very big items: the pet coke story, the parking story, the truck story. I guess there's two questions that come to mind as a follow-up. One is, given the forces arrayed often against implementing each of these things, and each of them requires, as you said, follow-up and monitoring and lobbying and advocacy and so on and so forth. How has there been a process where you prioritize across these various actions? First question. And the second question is there a feedback loop where people start seeing the consequences, the positive consequences of these actions? Because one of the, for example, with the odd-even scheme, which I thought was a very interesting, not just for its direct impacts on pollution, but it was a behavior-changing mechanism.
Absolutely.
But that, in a sense, got undermined because there were studies that came out and said, well, at the end of the day, it didn't have that much effect on air quality. But you wouldn't necessarily expect that it would, given that transport is somewhere between 20 and 30%, given that you only really focus on cars, given that it's half the population, given that there's wind, the difference could be washed out by local wind conditions and so on. So I guess what I see is a lot of positive actions that have been taken, but one wonders what piece of the pie those are, and if you're going to in fact deal with lobbies, stubborn people who sort of give lip service, citizens who have limited time, so they may give lip service to something but are not willing to change their behaviors. How do you get that feedback loop where citizens really understand what are the consequential changes they need to make, either in behavior or willingness to accept costs, say around parking, that will start seeing impacts in a reasonable period that will then lend further momentum to this problem? Are we in that sort of dynamic? I see all these victories, but I am a bit concerned that they're scattershot victories and that it will be hard to make them add up to something larger.
Absolutely. So, from time to time, the efforts are also made to give some kind of feedback on what benefits we have seen because of the action taken. It started with when we did CNG program. That was a time when it was shown with numbers that how the levels have stabilized. The World Bank even crunched numbers to show that how Delhi was able to prevent some numbers of premature deaths a year. So that was one kind of thing that has happened. Even now, after GRAP, there has been an effort to show that how this winter, even though it's too early for the jury to be out, we need to see a trend over 3 years now, but at least we now know that this winter we have seen less number of severe days, but of course more numbers of poor and very poor days, and there's still a long way to go. But people have to somewhere understand that the action does make a difference, and we need to own that. If you do not create positive stake in change, then you'll never be able to change the political mindset in the city. The politicians have to understand that people are recognizing that change, and that's why this feedback is absolutely critical. But the point that you're also saying, but it's very ironical that today, and a lot of scientific studies happening now to assess action, okay? But it's very funny. Every time an action is taken, large number of studies come to show how that has not worked, right? But studies don't happen to tell you if that action had not happened or if nothing is happening, how that is making things worse. And it's amazing, and all well-known institutions are jumping to say how, getting rid of old vehicles is not helping, how the odd and even has not helped. And to the extent, and it's very bizarre, that odd and even though, and even though it was not as comprehensively done, that is actually a grab action, right? But the scientific community had to tell and demystify the community and the people to say that the purpose of GAP is not long-term air quality benefit. Purpose of GAP is that when the emissions during a small episode, emissions are already out in the air. You can do nothing about it. And what it's making it worse is the adverse weather condition because there's no wind to blow it away and the whole compressed pollution that is happening. So all that you can do is not to further load the system with pollution. All that you can do is to shave off the peak, but no one said that. Everyone is looking at it, can be treated as a silver bullet that should have cleaned up the air completely. But that is absolutely a wrong premise to work with. But we have large number of studies today fighting to say that how it has not happened. But we also have studies to show that how the odd and even still did help to shave off some of the peak. Now the question is my number versus your number, okay? And that's where I really want to make a larger point. That today we are talking a lot about science-based air quality management, but the scientific community has a much bigger role to play. What we are finding today, and I would really like to make a distinction between the medical community and the scientific community, the science community. The medical community has been amazing right from the beginning. We have never seen a doctor mincing word. They have come out in the open even to fight official denial, right? But the scientific community, when they give out a number, like this number, okay, that 20% from vehicles, or any other number, the needy number, let's say some another number, and then the whole, the way these numbers then are used to misinform, then you will further deconstruct. 20% means that, it's only 10 or 2% cars. So why are you touching the car? Why odd and even when cars are responsible only for 2%? Now, so what's the point when you are doing source apportionment to understand the relative contribution of different pollution sources? Any source apportionment study is going to give you a pie chart at the end of the day like this. Only the relative contribution numbers may vary, okay? But the scientific community, when this kind of misinformation is happening, if they don't come out in the open to fight that disinformation, then you're actually doing much more harm. And we have seen that how science, the politics of science has done much more harm and slowed down action in the city. And that fight is even much stronger and bigger fight than ever. So therefore, we really want today, just don't say that it is important to know where the pollution is coming from. It is more important for the scientific community to say and crunch the number that fine, that's a relative contribution, my levels are here, I need to reduce it by 74%. So what does it mean? So how the action plan is not about a simple listing of action. The action plan has to show the degree of stringency that you're planning for. Every time we tell the community that please understand, we are talking about 74% reduction. Beijing in 2012 said 25% reduction by 2017. And for the 25% reduction, what is it that they had? The scale of public transport, dealing with it, industrial and coal power, to the extent that even capped the number of cars that can be sold. That's the level of stringency that you need. And that has to be the point of discussion today. Just not make a plan. Therefore, this 42 action points for the Ministry of Environment and Forest Right just gives you no sense that, what is it that you're really trying to achieve? How will it help you to move forward and reduce your pollution?
I think the point about the science and the translation of the science is really well taken. Sorry, the point about the translation of the science is really well taken. I think maybe as a warrior in this field, you can't be that explicit, but maybe I can sort of explain a little bit of the recent controversy about this. I mean, some of the recent studies that have come out show that vehicular pollution is much less important than other studies have shown, and that's partly because A, it was an all-India study, but B, they were looking at looking at it from an impact perspective, and therefore indoor air pollution was a much larger share of the total. So, in a sense, within the frame of reference of that study, they were correct. Within the frame of reference of this study, these guys were also correct. But for a lay person to understand why one graph shows 2% and one graph shows 20% for transport is extremely difficult, and it's extremely difficult then to understand what the policy implications are, which I think then brings us back to the question of to what extent can this really be an expert-driven dialogue? Well, I think one point is that to expect scientists to do this translation may be, a step too far. In a sense, we need intermediary organizations,
Yes.
I think, to do that translation. But I think what it also raises for me is the pathways through which most of these victories have been won, which I'd like to discuss a little bit more, which is through the courts. So, in a sense, you have now a sustained engagement with the Supreme Court in particular over a few decades, where this level of nuance and conversation, in a sense,
Yeah.
can be explained and understood. And so you have a set of recommendations, you have a set of prescriptions, you may have some ownership with the bureaucracy, maybe not entire ownership. You're not necessarily, you don't necessarily have that backed by a level of public understanding that then drives support for hard choices.
Right.
And so I'd like you to sort of, so I'm just tipping my hand, I guess. I'm sort of wondering whether there are limits to which we can drive this change with heavy reliance on the courts. And I'm wondering whether you see that as a possible limiting factor, what we need to go beyond. Clearly, the courts are indispensable as part of the story, but how far can we rely on them?
Yeah, you're right. So let's understand this. It's a very tricky issue because a very complex issue. And why? So let's understand. So there is an executive process and there is a decision-making process. Executive process is always slow. Now, what it really does not recognize the advantage and opportunity of a developing country like India, where at the early stages of growth, at the early stages of motorization, you have a much bigger chance of leapfrogging. And that leapfrog principle has to be somehow internalized in our policy making and decision making. And that somehow does not really happen. Why courts are needed? Courts are not needed actually to make the executive work or take decision. Executive does have a process, right? But how do you resolve the situation when, say, in 2014, there is an auto fuel policy committee, totally executive driven? They have all the experts in it, all the right institutions in it, and yet at the end of the day, they propose that BS6 or Euro 6 emission standards for vehicles can come to India only in the year 2026, right? Now, then what you do? So why you need the court? Court when, yes, there is a slack in decision, when you want to leapfrog, because clearly the community, as scientific community, we don't agree that we should delay the process so much, right? Then you have to challenge it, right? So, and ultimately that challenge did take to that leapfrog decision, but which is interesting, the decision was ultimately taken by the government. So the leapfrog to Euro 6 by 2020, that advanced it by so many years from 2026, was not a Supreme Court directive. But it could be taken to that level because you had all other ancillary campaigns happening, especially targeted at diesel. So all that catalyzed and accelerated that process. Other reason why you need the judiciary. So judiciary is more about it should happen early, quickly, don't delay. That's one very big part of the judiciary. Second part of the judiciary is also because often the executive process is so slow, they're also slowing the uptake of the rice governance principles of sustainability. So, as I said, how long will it take for the executive to recognize that we need parking policy as a demand management measure? But even then, executive took that decision in the year 2006 when the National Urban Transport Policy came. It was mentioned there. But for it to get translated at the state level, for the state governments to understand that principle, okay, it took so many years. And therefore, again, you need the judiciary to establish the principles for action. So therefore, this is a match that is happening, but at the same time, the judicial platform, the way it has evolved, is not actually an arbitrary platform. So if you really look at the way the entire decision-making process happens in that platform, where each and every department, each and every ministry is involved, and what is going to the court is first from the recommendation from this discussion. So it's not from the other way around. And the court takes decision based on what this group has recommended. But even then, it's not as sustainable, because the reason is that who is driving the judiciary then? As I said right in upfront. Okay, there is Supreme Court, there is NGT. The same NGT then gives you an order like put up giant purifiers, right? But NGT, I'm sure, is not saying it on their own. Somebody must have gone to the court and asked for it, right? So who's asking for it? That also is very important. For the NGT to say that get rid of 15-year-old, 10-year-old vehicles, but find a land where you can create a graveyard for the vehicles, right? So obviously things are not right, and that's really not the way. So it's a process of negotiation. It's a process of bottom-up pressure, and we are seeing that over a period of time, we are beginning to see the executive process creating its own systems, trying to engage, trying to negotiate. But it's a work in progress. It depends on the power of the community now to actually say that whether people have the enough knowledge, whether they understand to drive that process or not. Because it's a political process at the end of the day.
So I just want to ask you one more question before we open it up, and it sort of follows on from this. In a sense, what you've described, and this is perhaps just the reality of things, not just in air, but in other sectors in India, and to be honest, also in other countries, is that this is not following the sort of textbook, if you like, approach to a public policy problem, right? So, for example, in what we've talked about today, but also in the broader writing on air in India, you just don't see much discussion of costs, for example.
Yeah.
We just actually don't have a sense of how much different things cost. Then your standard sort of governance challenge of are those costs being focused, and therefore you can arouse political opposition, are those costs being distributed, and to what extent there's a constituency mobilized against it. So in other words, what is the implementation challenge of dealing with a problem given the distribution of costs, and then thinking through what piece of the solution is this, and then prioritizing according to these sort of metrics. So now that it never works in that textbook way anywhere, but I'm struck in particular by the absence of discussion around costs, and is that I mean, perhaps it's an artifact of the court-led process, but it would be very foolish to claim that you would have a more, quote-unquote rational process if it was a bureaucratic-led process or a political pressure-led process. But I'd like you to comment on this question of cost, and then and I just want to put another question in there. You talked about how the courts, not directly but indirectly, help stimulate this leapfrogging process. Why have we not seen a process where, given the visibility of air, different air pollution measures are on the political platforms of parties competing for elections, and it becomes the basis on which people vote? Ultimately, is that not going to be the sort of the most assured form of pressure for change?
Right. So clearly the cost, but cost which should be discussed along with fiscal instruments. Now, how do we really understand cost? Because yes, if you want to do something, it's going to cost you money. First, it's not about finding additional money always. It is also about reapportioning what you are spending according to the right principles. Why is it that Delhi government is spending disproportionately high part of its transport budget on making these elevated roads, widening roads, flyovers? The same amount of money could have spent to completely modernize and scale up public transport system. So therefore, how do you bring those choices and priorities? Just by changing your priority around. And that's where you really need a political process to fight that. The other part is, and that's where the court has been, is about finding the new money by applying polluter pay principle. Now here both government and courts have played a role. In fact, the fact that today in this country you have coal cess, right? And just 3 days ago there was a court hearing, and where the Supreme Court has actually taken stock of all these green funds in the country and the camper for coal, even in Delhi, and they found enormous amount of money that's just parked, and no one's spending that money. There's no protocol for spending that money, right? Now, why is the court looking into it again? If the money is with the government, they should be spending it, and they're the ones always saying that we don't have money, right? Now, they have actually applied polluter pay principle. But there are interesting cases today. In Delhi, the two funds, one fund created out of the cess on trucks, and another fund created out of the cess on big diesel cars. Now, the cess on big diesel cars today is being spent to set up more air quality monitoring stations in NCR. So it's a very nice way of mobilizing the local funds and resources for pollution control. So similarly, the truck money is also going for pollution control. It is meant to be spent on public transport, NMT infrastructure. They're spending it also on the RFID technology. So now, how do you therefore scale this up? That's the bigger issue. Now, so cost and benefit and looking at the cost, but more important, often we say that we shy away, thinking that there is no money and how can you do the leapfrog? But if you really look at the whole leapfrog that has happened for BS6 emission standards, where refineries have spent huge amount of money to clean up the fuel, right? Now, initially, we were thinking, can refineries do it? Everyone said refineries don't have money to do it, and that we'll have to come up with fiscal instruments to generate revenue and money for them to do it. But once the policy decision was taken that is going to happen, refineries found their own money to do it. We have done it without any fiscal instrument. The automobile industry is doing it. Even in Delhi, when the CNG happened, initially we thought perhaps that will require some fiscal support for the bus operators. But once the out and clear that no, we have to do this, the new business came to spend in that. So therefore, setting the right terms for investment, giving the right signals, that itself is going to bring big bang improvement. And then you can work on your fiscal instruments and other things. The other question that you asked about that why is it not part of the political conversation? And today, and it's interesting that when Aam Aadmi Party came to power and we saw their manifesto, we were actually quite happy to see that a manifesto and then finally the first budget, they did talk about all the right things. For the first time, there was a manifesto that did not mention flyover. It actually said public transport, it said NMT infrastructure. But something fell along the way. You could not sustain that electoral promise. And what is very interesting is that how the vote bank really works for the action and the measure. Why is it that even after so much, that the part of the vote bank, which was so angry about, say, BRT, they could achieve it. I'm not getting into the merit of it, but the fact is, it could happen. They could destroy it, right? But why is it that we could not still get say, the cycle tracks or buses or, other things that were also there? So, so who is aware, okay, but that's where the whole politics of aspiration comes in, right? And whether we are now powerful enough to establish new values for aspiration or not. Because if you try to have this dialogue with people that please do this because you have to save the earth, that is not going to work. Okay? It has to be part of, look, that's the fun thing to do. That's a cool thing to do. That's a new lifestyle that's going to build community. That's going to bring new glamour, new excitement in our life, public space making, public transport. It has to be completely new values will have to be built around it, so that you can change the conversation from standard of living to quality of life. That's the challenge.
Well, that's great. That's sort of two things in particular I want to sort of pull out from that, and then turn to the open Q&A. I think one of the messages which you talked about, and that is true from environmental regulation across countries, is that reducing pollution often ends up being much cheaper than those who have to do the reducing argue it will be ex ante. Almost inevitably, that's true. And that's, I think, an important message that is worth sort of pulling out. The other is I very much liked your sort of, in a sense, the reimagining of how we have to have this conversation, and that speaks a little bit to my slight concern with the language in the Comprehensive Action Plan, which is very sort of, a series of seemingly disconnected action items, as opposed to an integrated view, which is what you spelled out at the end. What kind of city do we want? So it's not just about parking charges, it's about parking charges as part of a larger conversation about rethinking mobility in a city like Delhi. And then, as you say, crafting that into an aspirational story about the kind of city we want to build, rather than saying, sorry, we got to tie your hands and force you to take a bus. So I think that re-envisioning of this air conversation, in a sense, it's an opportunity to think about it in a much broader canvas, and I really sort of welcome and applaud that way of thinking about it.